You okay? Good evening, and welcome to our annual Yom HaShoah commemoration event. Tonight, we pause to remember. We pause to remember what should have been the unimaginable, the manifestation of what is possible when man expresses his inhumanity to man. And tonight, I pledge to you our affirmation at the Heschel School, our commitment to educate responsible, moral individuals who remember our past and our history as they commit to creating a better and more just world for all. I want to express my gratitude to the entire Holocaust Commemoration Committee. This is a most unusual committee. Their commitment has been extraordinary, and I want to just mention several people. David Fogel, who I know is here, but I can't see a thing with the lights in my eyes, who has been responsible for having the archives digitized. That is no small feat, but it will give us access to those incredible, incredible archives. And to Fred Turner, who I know is here. And Fred Turner has in many ways served as the conscience of this committee, reminding us how we must commit to have our students involved so that they will carry on the work of this committee. And Fred, we have told you that we will do that, and to you and all the members of the committee, that is our pledge. And to Harry Uvegi. Harry Uvegi, who has been at the helm here as chair of this committee for so many years. I know he's been a member for 13 years, has been incredibly involved in facilitating and supporting these events. And to all of you who have come here tonight to remember, we thank you for being here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Harry Uvegi.
Thank you, Roanna, and thank you for everything you've done to support our committee. And thank you all for being here tonight, as this is the first Yom HaShoah event that we are experiencing in this magnificent auditorium. And to have all of you be here on what I experienced today, a very special day in this one campus. I have an echo back here. Pardon me, is that coming across, or am I just hearing it myself? What's that? There's an echo feedback here? No, I'm hearing myself talk in my own ears. I came early today because this was the first day after a long vacation, and I walked into this new building and was pleasantly surprised and wonderfully greeted by the way the school has transformed the reception at the lower school into the new chapel and part of the main lobby. The two walls that now remember what the children with their parents have written down on a newly designed brick that appears on the walls now, so as you leave tonight, you'll be able to see what's been written on those walls. I also experienced the lobby of the high school, which commemorated the children of the Holocaust and which the students of the senior class in a Zahor group that put together an amazing presentation of photographs of the children and stone glass images that remind each of the students as they walk through the building that reflected on a name of a child that once lived. And this is the first time that I've experienced a cohesive environment of all three schools commemorating in a way that I've never seen before. Truly remarkable. I also had the opportunity to experience some of the staff that during the past few weeks communicated with the committee in a way that we've never had before, in that they've truly engaged in the archives that we've been putting together since 1997. Every event has been filmed and recorded and is living in the archives. The stories that we've collected have been digitized and appear slowly on our site, as well as a virtual wall for all those parents and families who couldn't make it to put their name on the brick wall, have the opportunity to record their memory on the school site as well. I would like to thank a few people. The IT department headed by John Hutzler, who is here with us this evening, David Anderson, Abe Hendon, and I only know him by Zach. I don't know Zach's last name. Today, who all four of them helped tremendously in getting all this organized. And sometimes when I show up, it's met with a little bit of, happy to see you, but what do you want us to do today? And they managed to get everything done under pressure and in an exquisite manner. I'd like to thank Adina Korn for being here with the HCC harmonizers and the staff that maintains and supports us year after year in putting all this together and then taking it apart when we all leave. So thank you again for coming, and I also end with this wonderful experience. Earlier today, I had the opportunity and the honor to meet Fritzie in very poignant moments in how she presented her story to the 6th and 7th graders. And that was an amazing time. For you as a grandmother to absolutely tell an amazing story to children who were the age that you were when a different life happened. And I was touched by not only your story, but how the children came up to you at the end as if they were your own grandchildren, and the hugs that you got from them and the response that you gave them back was exquisite. And I look forward to hearing your story again. At this time, I'd like to invite the HCC harmonizers.
I grew up in Brooklyn and attended a yeshiva where most of my friends were also children of Holocaust survivors. And I think we all felt fortunate that our families survived the Shoah, even though no one spoke about it much at the time. I did realize, though, that my family was different from families that were not survivor families. I'll give you one short and I think funny example of how we were different. It's a fact that there is an upsurge in television sales before major sporting events like the Super Bowl or the World Series. That's when most people go out and buy a new TV. My family did not own a television set until the Eichmann trial was to be televised, and that was the impetus for my father to finally buy one. I have memories of him being transfixed in front of the screen watching that trial. My cousin Fritzie, who is speaking tonight, and pretty much the entirety of my family were part of the massive deportation of Hungarian Jews. From May 15th to July 9th, 1944, more than 430,000 Jews were taken from their homes and sent primarily to Auschwitz on 147 trains. Personal stories are a powerful tool in educating future generations. These stories are more important for the future than for the past. I'm proud to introduce my cousin, Fritzie Fritzshall.
Thank you, Marvin. I have to tell you, I am nervous tonight because my family's sitting here in the front row. So the rest of you can walk away and say, well, okay, she was okay or she was not, but I have to live with my family, so I'm going to try harder. I also need to tell you that I don't speak from notes. It's whatever comes today is what you're going to get today. When I was in Auschwitz, or when I was doing slave labor in a factory, and made a promise to 599 women that I would carry on the message that took me many, many, many years to live up to. I never dreamt I would be standing in front of all of you people here today, relaying the story of the Holocaust. You know, some of you in the audience may be survivors, I don't know. And I know, excuse me, many of you have met and know survivors. And no matter how many of us you're going to be speaking to or how many stories you're going to be listening to, we may have been in the same camp at the same time. We may have been standing next to each other. We have been looking in a different direction, and all of us may have seen something else, experienced something else, or felt something else. The story of the Holocaust is hard to bring across. I think historians are still having a hard time with it because they keep finding more and more of the atrocities that have happened, more and more of the camps in different areas, different villages, more and more graves that are being found through the countryside. So the story of the Holocaust is the story of all of us that have survived, but we carry the stories of those that have not. I was 13 years old when I was taken into the camp of Auschwitz. My training came through Hitler, the school of Auschwitz. I was born in a small town in Czechoslovakia. I think it was Hungary at that point. It became Czechoslovakia. Today it's the Ukraine. It's a place where the borders keep changing. I think they can't make up their minds. I was one of 3 children. I had 2 younger brothers. My mother, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my extended family, as all of you have today. My dad was able to come to this country just during the Depression years as the war was beginning. Immigration was very tight to come to this country in those days. When he came here, he earned $3 a week. Often when I speak to children, I ask them what their allowance is today. $3 a week. He worked in Chicago for a place you might be familiar with, Vienna Sausage Company. Out of that $3, he had to pay for his room and board, and $1 came to his family in Europe. He did not desert us, and he did not forget us. $1 to my mother in Europe was a lot of money because she could sell it on the black market. My family were farmers. My grandparents on both sides were farmers. My grandparents, the Davis side of the family, that's here today. On my grandfather's side, on my mother's side, they were farmers. My family on my father's side were farmers, lived off the land. We lived in a small town. The town that I was raised in did not have many Jewish people. We were a handful of Jewish people, but we lived close to a big city called Munkac or Munkachevo. I was raised in a religious home. I remember my grandfather standing and laying Tehillim. I remember on Saturdays, we weren't allowed to carry money or do anything, so we would walk into the big city as children do. We knew the war broke out. We knew when Hitler was coming into power. We didn't experience it personally, but we heard the whispers and we knew. What you need to understand is, and especially young people of today, we lived in the dark ages compared to today. We had a radio, but we didn't have anything electronic. We lived in small homes. Some of us didn't even have bathrooms in the house. We lived with outhouses. So we didn't have the cell phones, we didn't have television, we didn't have any of the luxuries that you have here today. When the rumble started, Hitler coming into power, in my community, we still lived in peace. We were a small community. The Jews kept to themselves very much. But I remember my playmates. Most of my friends were not Jewish. I remember we would go to the synagogue, they would go to the church, we respected each other's religion. If there was anti-Semitism directed towards my family, I didn't feel it, I didn't know. But you also need to understand that as parents, we have a tendency to hide things from our children. And I'm sure that there were things that were hidden from us children. I remember my grandmother giving my uncle eggs and putting them in a basket and asking him to take them to town to bring back news of what was happening in the world. That was the only way we could find out of what was happening. And the whispers were that things were not good. But we still didn't know anything about that. I remember waking up one morning to go to school. A man teacher stood at the door and raised his hand, and I can see him today, raised his hand to me and told me I'm not allowed to walk into class any longer. Jewish children are forbidden to go to school. This is the first that I felt different. This is the first that I knew I was different from my friends who were allowed to walk into class. I remember coming home, and my two younger brothers were there already. They were sent home as well as all the children, all the Jewish children in our community. I came home. I remember my mother sitting there with her 3 children around her and tears in her eyes, and tried to explain that there's a different world we need to live in. I couldn't understand. None of us could understand what was happening. The rules changed within minutes. Every minute, there were different rules that were posted. We weren't allowed to walk into a park and sit on a bench unless it said for Jews only. We weren't allowed to congregate outside. If 2 or 3 people stood together, we had to be separated or they would use a stick on us. We weren't allowed to walk into a grocery store, even though it was a small grocery store at that point. You need to remember we had the little mom and pop grocery stores that were about the size of a Starbucks. We Jews had to line up outside and have permission to walk into this grocery store to buy groceries. We lived off whatever we had as farmers. And little by little, our things started to disappear. I remember during the night, waking up, and my mother motioning to us to be quiet because our chickens were being stolen. And chickens make a lot of noise. And they were taking the chickens from us. I remember our bicycle being taken away from us simply because they could. They could. At that point, we didn't have the German soldiers in our town yet, but the community was against us. And so we had to live little by little with whatever we could have and whatever we could steal from our own farms that my family worked on. My mother took her children and went to my grandparents' house on her side. When Hitler came into power in Germany, he started to take away things from the Polish Jews that immigrated to Germany, became German citizens, fought for Germany. They were German first and Jews second. And he stripped them of everything they had, all their businesses, their bank accounts, their homes, and sent these Jews back to Poland. When these Jews came to Poland, Poland did not want them. Poland was anti-Semitic. They said they had enough Jews. They didn't want to take back the Jews that left Poland and immigrated to Germany. When these Jews came to Poland, they couldn't get a job. They couldn't get an apartment. They had no place to go, and they had no money to buy groceries with. So most of them went into the mountain areas. My grandparents lived close to the Polish border in the mountain areas. I remember at night getting knocks on the door from Jews that would cross the border from Poland into our community, looking for warm clothes, looking for food, looking for whatever we could give them to cross the border to take back to their families. We still lived in freedom. They were being persecuted. A Jewish home was easily found in our community because everybody had a mezuzah on it, and we didn't have the high rises as you do here. And so the knocks would come night after night after night. I remember as a little girl, my grandfather would hand me a bucket and would tell me to ask my grandmother for whatever we could spare, and told these Jews to go and wait for us in the barn, and we would bring them blankets, we would bring them food, we would bring them whatever we could spare at that point and give it back to them. Oftentimes, young people crossed the border. They didn't want to go back, so we would hide them. We would hide them in the barn. And I remember the soldiers coming with the bayonets. At that point, not the German soldiers, but the soldiers from our own community, the Czech soldiers. They were using their bayonets to go in the hay and in the straw to see if we were hiding anyone. When it got dark, we would put them on a wagon, cover them up with straw or a blanket, and take them into different areas, thinking that we were saving their lives, that we could hide them. Today we know that many of them were caught and sent into concentration camps. This is how we lived for a long time. One night, there was a knock on the door. I remember my mother standing there with her children around her, and the knock came, and there were soldiers with guns pointing at her, and dogs that they were holding on to tried to get at us. Let me tell you, I can tell you what a dog can do. It took me many years to learn to trust a dog. We were told we were going to be relocated. We were told to take our valuables, to take warm clothes, to take pots and pans, and we were going to be relocated. You need to remember, we knew nothing about Auschwitz or any concentration camp at that point. We did know about the final solution, but we didn't know what the final solution was or what they were talking about. So they lied, and we believed. The Jews in our community got their children together, got whatever food we had, made bundles, and all of us were put outside in our community in the center of town. We have just finished with Passover. We were taken away from our home the last days of Passover. We still had matzah in the house. We did not have any bread. And so whoever had whatever, they would pack and take all the food, and we came to the center of town. It was a very cold April night. It was drizzling and cold. And we came, and they stood us up, and we stayed in the center of this town. And we stayed, and we stayed, and we stayed. We weren't allowed to sit down. whether you were old or young, if you were pregnant or held a child, it didn't matter. No one was allowed to sit down. After many hours, the infants were cold and hungry, and they started to cry. So mothers were allowed to sit down, feed their babies, and stand up again. This is what we did for several hours. Finally, they came and took us to a ghetto area that was a small public school. They took over that small public school and put a fence around it and brought security, and the Jews in our community were brought into the small public school. That the room was totally empty. I remember walking in there with my grandparents and the rest of my family, and my mother taking her children and saying over and over and over, it's important we stay together. We didn't get any food that day. The next day, they came and announced that if we wanted any food, we would have to line up, and those of us that could do slave labor had to do slave labor in our community. We had to work on the farms or wherever they would assign us. So all young people had to go and do slave labor. My job was to work in an area where they were bringing the milk the end of the day, and my job was to wash out those big containers that milk was in. I was not quite 13 at that point. That bin was as big as I was, but I struggled and washed it. Oftentimes, young people that were taken to do farm work did not come back. The parents were told they would see them later. And again, those young people were taken to a camp. This is how we lived for a short time. One day, they came with trucks, these open-ended trucks, and asked all of us to go onto the trucks, to take our belongings and go onto the trucks, and we're going to be relocated. Again, we're going to be relocated. They took us to the train station. We came there, and there's this long, long, long train with many, many boxcars sitting, waiting for us. The boxcars were full of Jews that were picked up in different towns along the way. The boxcar that we were assigned to was full, totally full. They literally had to push us into this boxcar where we had to stand back to back. Nobody could sit down and nobody could to move. And when the boxcar lock came on from the outside, is the first we knew. Whatever we were going to be taken to was not going to be a good experience. The train started and kept going and going. I can talk about everything. The hardest thing for me to talk about is the rail car. There is one in Washington, D.C. If any of you have visited the museum, you walk through that rail car. We have a rail car in our museum in Illinois, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. And when we built it, we didn't have a boxcar. We couldn't get a boxcar. The building was up already, and we're all sitting around, and we're saying, how do you bring across the Holocaust, the story of the Holocaust, without a boxcar? We must find a boxcar. Some of you may know Michael Birnbaum. He was one of the people that helped us build the museum. And we sat around and said, we have this many days to find a boxcar because the building is up. And of Tzalachas, somebody had a boxcar on a farm, and we have a boxcar. I'm associated with the Illinois Holocaust Museum as well as the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And when I walk through the museum, I can talk about everything, I can do everything, but I cannot walk into the boxcar. The train kept going, and it stopped once a day. When it stopped, they asked for 2 young men volunteers from each compartment. One was handed a bucket, and was taken into a farm area on a field where they had a pump to get water. They would pump the water into this one bucket for each compartment. The other one was handed a bucket and told to put it in the center of this boxcar of each compartment. When this is done, the train starts and it goes again. The man that's in charge of the water has a ladle. So he's handing out a little bit of water for as many people as he can reach and as far as one bucket of water will go. So some of the people in this compartment would get water. The people that were at the far end were not getting any water because he ran out of water. So now you need to be with me. You're in this compartment. You're standing there against the next person. You're literally leaning against him. There is no air. You're hungry from yesterday because you came on hungry. You're thirsty. You're old. Or you're sick. Or you're a pregnant woman. Or you're holding on to an infant who is begging and begging for water. There is no water. The bucket that's put in the center of this compartment is used for a bathroom, for toilet. So now, how long are you going to hold out? You're on this train all day or since yesterday. I remember the old lady that we had to put a blanket around so she could relieve herself. We still had some dignity at that point. After that, there was no dignity. And everybody used that as a toilet. And I honestly believe that that was the first to take away our dignity. That bucket now is full, and it's overflowing, and you're standing in this bucket of whatever is overflowing all over the place. The smell, the fear of the unknown is something that I cannot get over. And so this train continues, and it makes its way, and it stops in a place called Auschwitz. What is Auschwitz? What are we doing here? The doors open, and we're greeted by very bright lights coming out of a very dark compartment. We're greeted by SS people pointing guns at us. We're greeted by dogs trying to get at us. We're greeted by loudspeakers giving us orders in a language most of us don't understand. We are greeted by all kinds of chaos, and there is a man standing in front of each compartment that is very, very dirty, very skinny, and he's wearing a striped uniform. His job is to empty each compartment as fast as he can. He comes onto this compartment, and he walks amongst children like myself, and he whispers in Yiddish, "You're 15. Remember, you're 15 when you get off. I'm 13. I don't know why I need to be 15, but we get off, and this is where the selection starts. This is where the families are torn apart. The old people go one way, the young people go another. The men and women are separated. The children are taken away. The pregnant women go a different way. My grandfather died in this compartment coming to Auschwitz. At that point, I think whoever took him did him a favor because he didn't have to go through the selection. And so the selection started. My brothers go one way. My grandmother, everybody is separated. My mother and I stand in one line. Then they call age again, and I looked at my mother and I told her she was in the wrong line. She went into a different line, and when I asked several hours later, when I would see her, they showed me the smoke. You try living with that one for a while. I don't remember how I came into the camp itself to this day. It's this many years later, I don't remember. I remember Auschwitz, I remember Arbeit macht frei, I remember the separation, I remember every single thing of coming into the railroad area, but I don't remember coming into the camp itself. I don't know if they carried me, if I came by train or whatever, I don't know. The first thing I remember is sitting in a straight chair and having my head shaved. I remember my tears and my hair mingling on my face as I was crying. I'm a young girl, my head is shaved. They gave me a uniform and a pair of clogs, and they pushed me outdoors. Auschwitz was a snake pit, a literal snake pit. I came outside. I remember standing, holding on to whatever they handed me, and just standing there shaking. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of head-shaved, uniformed, skinny, hungry, ugly women looking back at me. Those were the women that were taken there before us, that had experienced hunger and everything that came with us. And they were watching us come in, as we did after a while, watching the trains coming in and day night. And at night looking, maybe there's food, maybe it's someone we know, maybe they brought news from home. I remember standing there, and this lady who was so skinny and so dirty walked up to me, and we just stared at each other, and turned out she was my mother's youngest sister, my Aunt Bella. There's going to be a picture showing of her in a little while. I am standing here today because of her. I don't know what she had to do. I don't know if she had to sell her daily ration of bread, but she made arrangements with the people that were in her bunk bed to make room for me. She was the one that brought me through the worst days. She was the one that held me every single night and whispered in my ear, tomorrow will be better. You'll see, tomorrow will be better. This is how I fell asleep every single night. I remember waking up the first morning and the person on my side was dead. I remember we were on the top bunk and we had to bring that lady down. One of us took the head and one took the feet, and we had to bring her down and put her outside, because in Auschwitz, everyone had to be counted every single day. It was called a Pell. We had to line up twice a day to be counted, including all the dead people. We had to line up in the morning to get a cup of black coffee, sometimes a small piece of bread, and sometimes soup, depending on what they had that day. We had to stand in line for every little thing. My job in Auschwitz was to march out with a group of women every single day and go to an area where they had huge rocks. All of us had to carry those huge rocks from one side to the other side. Some of those were bigger than I was, and we struggled with hunger, but we carried those rocks because we wanted to live. Now all those rocks are on this side. So the next day they bring us back, we take them from this side, and we bring them back to this side. This is what my job was in Auschwitz. At night, when there were no lights, but when it got dark, people would start to sing a little song, or somebody would start to cook, or they would argue, my roast is better than your roast. I make a better meal. Everybody was so hungry, so hungry. But we needed to forget from what was happening, and so we were living in the past. We didn't know what was happening to our family. We didn't know what was happening to anyone. And this is how we lived in Auschwitz. We lived with lice. We lived with dysentery. We lived with infection. And we watched the trains coming in and day out. We watched the separation. We watched the rabbis coming in from one area and saying the Shema as they were being led to the gas chambers. Yes, we knew where we were at that point. There was always a selection. We had to get undressed and form a line. And Dr. Mengele or his entourage would stand there with a stick, and we would have to run in front of him. If one had a pimple or a scar or was too fat or too skinny, or when the hair started to grow in and it was gray, we would take dirt and we would rub it into those women's heads so it didn't look gray. And there was always one line or another line. One line went directly to the gas chambers, and one line went back into the barracks. And we never knew if we were in a good line or a bad line till the very end. One day, there was a selection. Our area, my entire barrack, was put into a holding barrack, and we knew we were going to the gas chambers from this holding barrack. They had a selection in the last minute. My aunt was chosen to go onto a truck and to be taken somewhere else. I was marching into the gas chambers, and because I was hoping to go with her, I was at the very end of the line. She saw me walking to the gas chambers, and her truck pulled away. The very last moment, 6 of us were pulled out from the end of the line, put onto another truck, and taken to do slave labor in a factory. I was one of 600 women doing slave labor in this factory. My job was to put a little spring into a compass that was going onto a plane. If we thought Auschwitz was hungry and bad, this was even worse. We were literally starving. I was the youngest of 600 women. 599 women gave me little crumbs of their bread, allowed me extra rest, and took care of me. I had 599 mothers. They take care of me. In turn, I made a promise. I made a promise that if I survived, I would tell the world what happened. I was their hope, because you and the rest of the world needed to know what was happening. And we said, who's going to believe us? Who's going to believe about all of these horrible things that are happening here? How can one human being do these things to another human being? Nobody will believe us, but maybe. The war was ending. My group and I were put on what is known today as a death march, where we walked through the towns and the fields because they didn't know what to do with us anymore. They couldn't feed us anymore. We slept in the fields. And as I said earlier, my husband loved escargot. Escargot is snails. We were digging in the ground for snails. We would have eaten the bark and the leaves off a tree. We were so hungry. We were in a field that was cold. We woke up in the morning, and we were surrounded by the Russian army. And so my group was liberated by the Russian army. And I always say that I had 3 lives. I had a life before that was very good. I had a life during. Those were the darkest day. And I have a life today. This is my 3rd life. And so I came to the United States. I joined my dad. I came here. I would not admit to anyone that I was a survivor. I didn't speak the language. I came with nothing. You're going to see some pictures that my dad had. I came with absolutely nothing. Everything was taken away from us. I came here, and my dad knew I was a survivor, and he cornered me once and wanted to know, do I know what happened to his sons, and do I know what happened to his wife? And we didn't speak about it afterwards because I couldn't and I wouldn't. I needed to become a normal child. I needed to learn the language. I needed to become a normal American girl. The Holocaust, that may have happened to 6 million people, but it didn't happen to me. It is so easily done in the daytime. But then come the nights, and the nightmares, and the waking up, and the realizing that if you woke up in a sweat. My husband used to wake me up every night and say, it's okay, it's only a dream. This is what I did for several years. I would not admit that I was a survivor. I raised my son, who knew his mother was a survivor, and he came, when he went to Hebrew school, he came and asked me, can I talk about it? And I said, we're not going to talk about this. And he never asked again. When I became a grandmother, a small Holocaust museum was built in Skokie because of the marches from skinheads. There was an article put into the Chicago Tribune asking for survivors to come forth and have their stories recorded. I saw this every single day, but I was not a survivor. I didn't need to do this. My son came to me one day and he said, Mom, you need to do this because I need to know, and your grandchildren will need to know. He says, take this article, take a blank tape, go to the museum, have them record your story, sign everything they want you to sign. Don't ask for anything, but ask for a copy of this tape. And so I did. So the first day I came, off Tzalachas, the camera broke, and I said, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm not going back. But I did go back. The interviewer was a terrible interviewer. And I kept saying, yes, it happened. No, it didn't happen. And I really never gave a good tape. But I came back in the car. I had a friend with me and got back into the car after the interview. And I became a survivor. This is where the floodgates opened for me. This is where I admitted to myself that I was one of those children that went through hell and back. But I still couldn't speak out. I wouldn't go to any schools that asked me to go. I just couldn't speak out. One day, there was an article that appeared about someone that was a janitor that was a Nazi and that was a killer in one of the camps. And he came to this country and they were going to deport him, and the community stood up for him. After all, it is this many years later, we need to forgive. And I stood up and I said, forgive for what? For whom? Who's it up to forgive? And I became involved with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. When the U.S. Holocaust Museum was first being built, there was a program on radio called Milt Rosenberg's program at night. And someone, and I don't know how they got to me to this day, but they came and asked me would I appear on this program with two people that were building the museum while it was still on paper in Washington. And I appeared on that program, and they asked me would I help them fundraise to build the U.S. Museum. And I said, sure, thinking once a month, once in 2 months. Well, it turned out an every night deal. My husband and I went to Washington to see, while it was still on paper, what they were going to build. And I looked at him and I said, this is what we're building, and this is what I'm going to do while you're having dinner by yourself at home every single night. And got involved with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. Then we had the march in Skokie, where the Nazis were going to march in Skokie. And this is where we realized that we survivors need to stand up and teach. And we decided that we're going to have a small museum when we met in a basement in someone's basement, and little by little raised money, and we built a small museum on Main Street in Skokie. We, from Skokie, were the first to have the mandate passed to teach a unit of the Holocaust in the schools. Skokie, Illinois was the first. From that, we were able to build the big museum. The museum gets between 400 and 500 students a day from all over to teach. We are a teaching institution. I am about teaching children. What you need to remember is that 6 million people were killed during the time of the Holocaust, although history tells us today where they're uncovering bodies all over the fields that it was much, much more. You need to remember 1.5 million babies. Babies that were killed during the time of the Holocaust. I stand before you today, and I know that I'm up in years, and I don't know how many more years I can stand up and speak as most of the Holocaust survivors. The young people here today, in 5 years from today, 6 years from today, you may never meet another Holocaust survivor. But this is my history, and it is your history. And you need to learn, and you need to remember. And I thank you. We were going to show the pictures. Let me tell you about those pictures. The pictures you're seeing today is the lady on the left is my Aunt Bella. She was my mother's sister. She was the lady that saved my life in Auschwitz concentration camp. She did not survive. The lady next to her was a neighbor. There was a doctor's house next door. She was a neighbor. The picture, 3 ladies you're looking at today, the lady in the center is my mother. The lady on my right is my Aunt Bella, again, who did not survive. My mother did not survive. The lady on my left is my dad's sister. She survived Auschwitz concentration camp. I have to tell you, she was liberated by the American Army. She had typhoid afterwards and was quite ill. She, when we were liberated, didn't think any of us survived, so she went to Budapest instead of coming back home, saying none of her family survived. She stood in line, waiting in line, because food was still being rationed after the war. As she stood in line, there were 2 ladies or 3 ladies in back of her talking about me by name. She turned around and she said, "Who are you talking about?" And they repeated my name, and that's how she found out that I was alive, and she came back home. Are you showing another one? The gentleman you're showing now was my grandfather. That was Marvin's and Milton's father, and they're here, grandfather as well, and they're here today. And he was the one that I was taken away with, and he was the one that died in the boxcar going to Auschwitz concentration camp. This picture was taken in a town called Schönbach. After we were liberated, my uncle, Marvin's father and Milton's father, communism came in and they created a border. I got caught under communism, and my Uncle Jack, excuse me, was able to leave and go into an area which was part of Czechoslovakia, but it was called Schönbach. And he paid a guide to bring me across the border in the middle of the night in snow, and I crossed the border. We're another book for another story. And these people that are sitting there, the 2 ladies on my right one on top and one on the bottom, are two sisters. Those are my cousins, Hattie and Elvie. The gentleman in the middle is Marvin's and Milton's father, who survived. My Aunt Frida, this is the lady that survived and came back home from Budapest. And on the right is yours truly, me. This is a picture that was taken when I came to this country. And I lived in Chicago already, and I came to visit my uncle, Jack, and my tante Blima here in New York City. I think that's all. And so, from my past, this is all I have left, are some of these pictures that my dad had and gave to me, and we sort of pieced together our lives. You know, I stand here and I look at these pictures and I have memories of my grandfather. Before Passover, you know the song Oven Pripachik? It's a big oven. My grandfather had this huge oven in our community, and the Jews would bring all their flour or whatever they used for matzah before Passover. And they would come to my grandfather's house, and they would each bake their matzah. And I remember my two brothers and I standing there making the little holes in the matzah with a little, whatever it was, kind of a round thing. And they would take this matzah and they would put them into barrels, cover it up, and put it in my grandfather's attic. And before Passover, after they burned the chametz, all of them would come and take down their barrel of matzah and take it home. And so, for me, Passover is a bittersweet holiday, and I have bittersweet memories because I can remember my grandfather performing a Seder with pillows, sitting there with pillows around him, and the Seder would last for hours and hours to the point where our heads were falling into our soup bowls. But that was the last holiday that I had at home with my family and my grandparents. So, end of story. Thank you.
Will you all please stand? El Malei Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamitzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei HaShechina B'mahalot Kedoshim Utehorim Kezohar Harakia Mazehirim Et Nishmot Kol Acheinu B'nei Yisrael Anashim, Nashim V'taf Shenehergu V'shenitbechu V'shenisrefu V'shenechneku V'gan Eden Tehei Menuchatam Anaha Bal Harachamim Hastirem beseter kenafecha liolamim Utzror bitzror hachaim et nishmotehem Adonai hu nachalatam V'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkevotehem ונאמר Amen. Please join me in Kaddish. Gadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'yimru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach li'olam u'li'olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shmei d'kudusha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran b'yalma v'yimru Amen. Yehei shaloma Rabbah min Shemaya, v'chayim alenu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimru Amen. Useh shalom b'mromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, alenu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yal kol yoshvei tevel v'yimru Amen. Please join me in singing Hatikva. Kol hod balevav penimav, nefesh Yehudi homiyah. Fateh Mizrach Kadima Ayin Letzion Sophia Od lo abda tikvateinu Hatikva shenot al apayim Le'otam chovshi Artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Le'otam chovshi Artzenu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
Thank you. You're welcome to join us in the lobby for some refreshments and to view the Holocaust archives from the committee. Thank you.